Welcome to Falmouth University's final and third podcast exploring its Springboard Studios project. Springboard Studios was Falmouth University's contribution to the Healthworks Cornwall project, funded by the European Social Fund. Our project was looking at how creative, non-assessed, place-based and altruistic learning experiences can improve our students' mental health and well-being, helping them with that all-important transition into employment after university. So once again, welcome to this third edition of the Springboard Studios podcast. I'm delighted today to be joined by Anna Mankee-William, Associate Professor for Arts and Health, Cam Harandy, External Funding Manager even, and all-round financial guru for the university, and Rob Ingram, Senior Lead for the new Academy for Continued Education. Is that just about right?
Close enough.
Close enough. Well, thanks for all joining me this afternoon. I'm going to kickstart by just kind of mainly over to you, because at that point I wasn't part of the project, on the call that was put out by Healthworks Cornwall, why the university felt like it wanted to make a response to that call. Some of the needs of the project, we were talking a little bit about this over lunch, weren't we, Anna, about why specifically we responded to that call. So any thoughts from you, from your perspectives?
So I think I can start off this discussion. So I came over to the university from Cornwall Council with a health and care background. And when I came over to university, I was really concerned about the data that we were seeing around mental health in students. And I was really kind of horrified that actually in my strategic role in the past, I'd never even considered the 5,000 students that come into Cornwall. So once we'd started to look at the data, I started to talk to Professor Greg Whelan around what would a creative programme look like in order to support students as they transitioned into university, because we'd done a small survey and they had identified that this was one of the biggest stressful times for them. So we started to talk about what that programme might look like and how we could have a really creative and different approach to it. And then identified we were looking for a source of funding, and the European Social Fund call came out. And it looked to us that we could fit into that. And students are classed as inactive. So that's a really sort of a primary element of European social funding. And we decided we would go for it. But I know, Cam, you were certainly around at the time. And Rob, I think we had conversations about whether or not it was relevant, appropriate and doable.
Yeah, I think if we kind of cast our minds back, the pandemic was still very much at the forefront of our minds as well. So there was this duality of people being kind of locked down, and we realising there was going to be a legacy effect of that. Massive disruption in the labour market. So obviously the twin themes of the project were around supporting people to improve their mental health with the aim of being able to transition into graduate level employment at the end of the programme. So it did really seem to hit two quite important strategic aims.
It did, yeah.
Absolutely. ESF, European Social Fund, is about the labour market, and this particular call came out from a need that identified, I think the stats were something along the lines of 2,000 odd individuals out of every 100,000 in Cornwall suffered from some sort of mental health issue, and that was seen as a barrier into employment. Anna, you spoke about inactive. That was our key into the university playing a part in this. But the actual European Social Fund was more about the individuals who were so far removed from the labour market. So our intervention around that transition from the student inactive into the labour market, and combined with the pandemic and those pressures, it was really timely, wasn't it? It was like it was written for us, but because of that particular time.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And there was something very unique to the bid that you and Greg wrote, which was based on a lot of the Daisy Fancourt work. Daisy Fancourt, an associate professor at University College London. And Daisy's done a lot of work around how participation in creative activities can improve non-acute and non-clinical mental health, which is a real unique proposition to an HE institution who are primarily teaching arts-based courses.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, Daisy's done some really interesting work. And in fact, there's an awful lot of interesting work out there, including Daisy and a co-author who have written a recent report for the World Health Organization about the role that art and creativity can have in emotional well-being and resilience. So it is an area where I come from the health world, and we do things in a certain way in the health world, and that is, and what we understand is that we do things we do the science well, but still don't necessarily change a lot for a lot of people. So there has to be a different way of looking at mental well-being and emotional resilience. And COVID is going to really stretch us in this. And what struck me when I came to university is that I think that art-based research and creative practice is undervalued within this space, and that we really could look at how we can be creative around helping people, and in this case young people, to build emotional resilience, to build well-being tools, to self-regulate with emotion, to enable them to not self-sabotage, to increase confidence, to increase self-belief. These are all fundamental things as you develop through your life. In fact, COVID is having a massive impact on all of those things. So Daisy does some amazing work, as do a few other people. And for us, it was about looking at what that might look like in a model that Greg had a really good idea about how we might do, but it was very flexible. So there were a couple of key things in it. That being place-based, and we didn't know what that actually meant, but we knew it was important to bring in our local landscapes and our local things into that. And he was very, very clear that we needed to provide an opportunity to students that was non-assessed, because we recognise that it's the assessments that drive a lot of the stress. We also recognised, and again, when I started to look at this data, I was quite shocked that we do have a higher prevalence than other universities of neurodiversity. Now, this is quite, it's challenging for the organisation as a whole, because we, as most organisations do, you tend to deliver a neurotypical kind of curriculum. You deliver it within neurotypical spaces. I mean, I'm looking at Rob here because you're very well used to this.
I think it's something like 36% of our students have got some form of declared disability. There's always a number that aren't declared within that as well, and that is against a sector average across all universities of 17%. So it's over double, which is really, really significant.
Absolutely. So you've got so you've got a significant number of our students who are neurodiverse in some way, and so many of our processes and the people are very accommodating of that, but actually there is something that really needs to potentially be addressed when you link that to mental health. And what a lot of young people will say is, if you're neurodiverse and you have a mental health issue, or that is a double whammy, and some will say you might as well give up. I mean, that is the catastrophic end of those two things coming together, but it does make it much more difficult. And so therefore the non-assessed space and place-based space with a creative activity, when we triangulated those things, we were saying there's got to be a model in the middle that we can do something with to ease some of the stressors that the students are experiencing, that are impacting then on their view of how they transition into employment.
I think one of the really significant things, and I know, Sasha, you're really passionate about this bit, is that effectively this programme was co-designed with the students.
Absolutely. So as the producer, I wasn't kind of sitting in my office in isolation going, what is it that students need? And without knowing it, I've become a kind of natural design thinker, which really places need at the start of a project. So what is the need? And I know that you'd kind of done your research, Anna, beforehand, but as soon as we started that project, it was like, let's not make assumptions about this. Let's get to the kind of granular detail of what that need is. And students were saying it was about anxiety, no professional confidence because they couldn't get work placements because of COVID, all of those different things. So let's look at need and then think about how we design a programme. So it started with really finding out that kind of specific problem that we were trying to solve, and then talking to the students about what projects, what would a programme look like that would really benefit them? And you have to be quite careful in that. You don't say kind of what do you want, because we might not deliver that, but it's kind of what do we need and how can we collaborate to help solve some of those problems in a way that uses all of that evidence of place-based learning, which can build social capital, equity, agency in students. So yeah, that was really, really critical to the project. And some absolute gems of kind of ideas came from that co-design process, talking to students. I remember fondly a co-design session with some third year graphic design students saying, what does a summer school look like for you? And one of the students, Alfia, who actually went on to become a paid intern on the project, said, I really want to give back to the local community. And it was really interesting that was one of the 5 steps to well-being that we hadn't yet embedded in the project. And that came from the students. And actually that became a kind of a really central part of the final programme, which we can go into a little bit more detail about. That actually at the end of it was this idea of altruistic and giving back to the local community, because without knowing it makes us feel better.
Yeah, absolutely. That's really important.
And that's interesting, going back to why we bid into this particular call. I've got a piece of paper in front of me that kind of reminded me of the call, and they talked about additional and innovative approaches to pre-employment training. And that's exactly what we did.
Yeah.
With that design thinking methodology at its base. We didn't know what it was, but we knew there was something there.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And I think one of the other things that was very, very unique to place-based learning that we have here in Cornwall was inspired by the work of Professor Wallace Nichols in a book called Blue Mind, if anyone's interested. And a blue mindset is one that's created from being in or near water, and that can be in urban spaces as well as rural spaces, and that will create a mindset that's curious, connected, collaborative, calm and connected. Now, as a creative HE institution that's surrounded by water, how can we capitalise that in our learning if it's going to, one, improve our student well-being, which we know is a problem where there are no existing interventions, but it can also support curiosity. Don't we want that in their learning? As well as creativity. So I think that was kind of like, that's a very, very unique proposition to an HE institution that teaches creativity.
So we've got the kind of co-created together, informed around this, the principles of blue space, creativity, and all of that kind of at its heart in terms of helping, in a non-assisted way, helping students to, I think, get into a space that would have hopefully helped develop, improve their resilience, their mental health, and therefore be in a much better position to be able to start applying for opportunities after university in a way that perhaps they wouldn't have otherwise been able to do in the same way.
Yeah, great.
And the other thing I was going to say about that is the long-term economic benefit of a programme like this, because what we know is mental ill health costs businesses billions a year, and it also costs the health service billions a year, and where we can enable students to go into the workplace with the tools that enable the resilience, that has to be a good thing in terms of that sort of long-term economic benefit, but also around where the costs actually sit.
Great. What do you think worked? What did success look like? What didn't, and what were the lessons that we've learned as an institution?
Can I start with some stuff that didn't work?
Why not?
Yeah, so I think one of the challenges of a project like this is there's funders, and the funders need to be assured that we're spending the money in an appropriate way, but that practically means a lot of paperwork, horrible CRM systems that everybody hates using, and us nagging students for paperwork and consent forms, all of which is pretty counterintuitive to supporting their mental well-being and resilience. So in an ideal world, I think more flexibility, and there needs to be due diligence, and people need to be assured that money is being spent appropriately, but the level of evidence required actually in some ways probably undid some of the good work that was happening alongside that programme. And I think probably that's a note to funders doing these sorts of calls in the future, if you're dealing with potentially vulnerable people and you're focusing on their mental health, don't put a load of unnecessary barriers in their way just to satisfy the needs of kind of bureaucratic funding methods.
And that's compounded, isn't it? Because you've got at the top level European Social Fund, and they've got their programme. Then you've got the DWP, Department for Work and Pensions, who are the managing authority for England. And then you had, in our case, Cornwall Council. So you have these layers that are added to reduce risk for each contract holder. And then we're part of a much broader collaborative partnership, weren't we? So we were a higher education institution, there were FE colleges, there were others, spanning the breadth of what I just explained in terms of the call, innovative approaches to pre-employment training. So you get these, bureaucracy on top of bureaucracy. So I agree with you, Rob. Funders definitely have a huge part to play in the shape of delivery, not just the call and the stats and the need.
Yeah, I think that's both of those are really valid points. And I think what became very apparent and really interesting is that the original call, when you read it, really made you think this is going to be a really flexible and adaptable call. And the actual call that's what it generated. The systems behind the running of that call were lifted and dropped. So, for example, the platform that you were discussing there, Rob, was lifted and dropped from a sort of a routes to work, from a job centre type platform. That has a completely different approach in terms of, if you don't turn up, you're not going to get paid, right? This is not what this call was all about. So there's something, the key learning for me is that whatever systems you have at the back end, both the digital platforms and also the other bureaucracy that you need to do, the processes, it has to be right for the call that you put out. And if you want creativity and if you want innovation and if you're not operating in a kind of a hard-nosed discipline type way, if it feels softer for that, then I think it needs something different. Of course, there is the issue around how much these bespoke systems and bespoke sort of processes then cost. My view is that the benefit comes in your outcomes for that, because I think you're right. There were some incidences where the bureaucracy that we had to do was counterintuitive to the success. So, I think that needs to be balanced. Now, what that takes is creativity within what are, on the whole, risk-averse organisations that either fund or are managers of the fund. So it challenges them, I think.
And what's really important is having a contract manager who has a context of your project, not someone who's sitting at a desk in Leeds, for argument's sake, doesn't even know the context of we talked about place, so Cornwall. What's the labour market like in Cornwall, for example? That I've been fortunate enough to be working on projects where the contract manager's really got a vested interest, not least because they live across the road, for example, and they can see the output. That will help. I don't think we can get away from bureaucracy. You have to measure impact in some way. Yep. Sometimes at a very high level, those measures are quite arbitrary. But bring the human factor into it.
There was a fascinating point on the context as well, with some of the outputs were obviously around job search and job acquisition. And I remember early conversations where the expectation was about actual job outputs. And I was having to have a conversation about the labour market looking very different for graduates, and the amount of work required by those students and graduates into searching for and applying for graduate level jobs was significantly more than entry level jobs in a whole range of other sectors. And that just, again, I think probably links back to the job centre type systems. It almost, the funders didn't particularly care what the job was that the person was doing. But for us in a higher education context, it's quite important that the graduate is doing something that they want to do, that they feel they're able to utilise their skills for. And more often than not, they tend to get classified as graduate level roles.
Yeah, that's right. we navigated it, and we managed it, and we achieved our outcomes. But there were some difficult times when we would have rather put all our energy into that sort of frontline work with the students, where some of us had to kind of sit there and go, right, no, look, we have to do this. This is a funder requirement and we have to do it. We might not like it. We kind of understand it because we understand the organisations that the money funnels through. It is irritating, but we all came back to, we're doing this because of what we see in terms of student mental health and well-being. And if we can address some of that, and if we can give some of them the tools that they need going forward, then it has to be worth it. But there was a bit of pain involved.
Yeah, but it really did work, and I think that's probably the bit we've really got to celebrate. Seeing, from my vantage point, perhaps more secondhand than you, Sasha, but seeing the transformation in those students and the confidence when they're sitting through some of their pitches and final project and ideas was incredible.
Yeah, so just to give that some context, that the final programme was called Blew Your Mind, and taking that evidence of participation in non-assessed, creative, place-based and blue space learning, in our case in Cornwall, we took engaged students with a number of creative learning experiences in coastal locations across Cornwall, because it develops a blue mindset. And at the end of it, the students came back and giving altruistic learning is one of the 5 steps to wellbeing, and the students responded to a brief presented by Surfers Against Sewage. So it's kind of like circular thing. Water's good for you, now you give back to it. And I think that, in fact, that's the last line of Blew Your Mind. You need water and water needs you. So that just gives that some context. What worked? What else worked well?
I think the co-design worked well, and I think that's down to you. And I think the evolution of the programme worked well. So we all kind of walked that journey with you and with the students. And so the final year's programme, which had kind of plumped on, Blew Your Mind, there was some creative writing in there as well, because that seemed to work really well. It was an evolution to that, and I think that journey was essential in terms of a programme like this, but I think it was really successful in the end.
I think one of the interesting parts with that is that all the stuff we've talked about there was really successful. I think it was probably more of a challenge getting students engaged into some of the more career type workshops, and I think we fairly early on realised that we needed to make that support more invisible in the programme, and I think probably by the end of the programme that wove together in quite a good way. But there was less of a draw for coming along and doing career-based workshop sessions, but where it was embedded within all the nice fun stuff, actually the engagement was really good and actually put it in a slightly different context for people.
I think what worked is the team.
I was thinking the same thing, Cam.
I'm putting myself in there, but I think we all brought something to the table. Either we were shielding the bureaucracy so that creativity could just happen, or we had the foresight of what the challenges are beyond this. And the other thing I was thinking about is your point around adaptability. Going back to the programme, it was a 3-year programme, so we could make some mistakes. And then the final year, we knew what the product was. The first couple of years, we were just figuring out, you were figuring out what the students might need, Sasha. So,
and in context, some of those early stuff, and we talked a bit about COVID, but, right at the start, there was, these students hadn't met each other, they hadn't been on campus, and these were the groups of students that we were trying to work with and engage. And, if we kind of cast our minds back to that, people were quite scared about meeting in spaces together. So creating a space, and I think early on that, there were comments about how good it was to actually meet people and see people in a kind of curated way that they got to help shape and design.
Absolutely. And credit to everybody, because we're the same team that started 3 years ago. Everybody turned up to a weekly meeting, even at the end, which it actually is quite unusual. A lot of people drop off.
Yeah.
So well done, everybody.
Yeah, and actually, big shout out to other people involved as well. So Lauren, who very ably looked after the administration, and probably, to be fair, had most of the headaches when it came to the.
She was at the front line, wasn't she? Yeah.
And also to Owen as well, who did an awful lot in terms of supporting students on an individual basis, and quite a lot of paperwork chasing as well.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And Nick from our end for doing, getting the money to come in.
Yeah, absolutely. And chasing timesheets.
And chasing you for timesheets.
Chasing me for timesheets. Yeah, absolutely. So it was a real team effort. We all brought something and we all stuck it out to the end. And I think that does demonstrate how committed we were to the actual model that we were testing out.
And I think having the right representation around the table, from incredibly student facing to kind of employability in your former role, Rob, to the funding, to the kind of liaison, and right through to kind of sitting in the research team. It was kind of that breadth of skill set and knowledge and experience and passion. I think that was kind of the contributed to the success of the team. Going back to the students. From your perspective, what do you think? And am I right in thinking that this was the first time the university had ever done a project for its own students? A research project, a wellbeing project? I'm looking at you, Cam, in terms of external funding projects. How many projects do we do that specifically benefit our student community?
Well, that's an interesting point. So as a university, we get funding from the student fee. OFS, the Office for Students, also give us some funding. And then from a research angle, we get quality research funding from Research England currently. So we're kind of subsidised from various funding sources, strategic, structural sources. European structural investment funds weren't really designed for our own customers, for want of a better description. But in this example, because of that transition from education and that status, that inactive status, it meant that we were eligible for the first time. We have done other schemes like placements, for example, internships, things along. That's where Rob and I started working together years gone by.
Postgraduate
but nothing
placements,
around the well-being. And I think going back to timing, COVID, the generation we're dealing with, perhaps that had something to do with it as well.
Yeah, I think if you examine the data, it's very scary, and COVID has significantly exacerbated that. And we've got 20 years worth of COVID impacted young people that are going to be coming into this organisation, all of which will have both some similar and some different impacts, depending on what age they were when they experienced the COVID lockdowns and the pandemic. And we have to be adaptable, we have to be agile, we have to understand what's coming, what's going to hit us. And we need to have the flexibility, in my view, to alter our provision or bring extra provision in or do something so that we are responding to that. Because after all, it's their education that will be impacted, but it's our ability to educate. And the stress on the workforce of trying to educate young people who maybe they don't understand anymore because they had COVID, they were impacted by COVID, say when they were 7, and there were crucial social, psychological, emotional things that didn't happen for them. So there's all sorts of reasons why a programme like this, the timing was absolutely right. And we are going to learn from it. We're definitely going to learn from the way that we came to this last programme. And it has been deployed and implemented. Now, organisations are like juggernauts to sort of influence and turn around, and that's fine. We know that that's the case. But having a successful programme, being able to kind of drill down and say, this is a nugget that actually probably doesn't cost very much, that we could see if this is what helps us to be agile over the next 20 years. Some of us will be longer, I'll be retired by then, but that's not the point. The point is that our young people deserve for us, they are the future, and they deserve for us to be thinking about this and to be saying, well, we can't do everything, but I'm sure as a creative university, we can be creative and we can be more agile, but we kind of have to be really. And this was part of learning about that.
One of the really lovely things about this particular cohort of young people that we were working with, these were people who were feeling anxious or felt like had low levels of resilience, rather than dealing with perhaps students at the acute end. So if you kind of think about how universities need to utilise their resources, a lot of the resources get directed towards the treatment end, where students are really unwell mentally and they require all of the counselling and wellbeing services. This was a project that enabled us to be really quite proactive, where people were starting to feel a bit worried or a bit unsure or a bit uncertain. This was a whole package of support just for them. My guess is that this cohort of students, we will have helped mitigate some of those things that may well have developed into mental health problems later. Won't have. It's really hard to measure a negative that we can't see. But I think kind of common sense would tell you that working with these people to help alleviate some of their stress, some of their anxiety, improve their resilience is probably ultimately going to have prevented a decline into further mental health issues.
That's a really good point. So coming back to added value, why did we need ESF to support this? We've got student support officers, we've got mental health support in the institution. They are at the acute end. They're dealing with students who've got identified problems. Our added value through Springboard was to limit that transition. Now, I don't know what those stats might be or that transition might be, but yeah, we were definitely filling a gap that perhaps the university didn't know existed until it's too late, and that's where the student support officers come in.
Yeah, I mean, there's also something interesting, and it wasn't particularly easy, about enabling students to recognise that maybe they are feeling a bit under pressure. Maybe, and I used to say to students when they say, "Oh, I don't have any mental ill health," I said, "Are you sleeping?" "Oh no, right, well, okay then," because if you have repeated nights when you're not sleeping, there's something that's creating that, but also it's not good for you. So therefore, you are legitimately able to engage in this program, because that's what we're about. We're about calming your mind. We're about creating curiosity. We're about all of those things that actually bring satisfaction and some stability, into the lives that you lead. So, and we weren't funded, or we didn't have the skills also to deal with the acute end of mental ill health. And we were very clear about that. Where we did have the skills, we had skills to engage young people who had identified themselves that maybe there were some things that were impacting them. And that's really important, because a lot of people they don't acknowledge, there's complex reasons why they don't acknowledge that there's stuff in their lives which that is impacting on them, and that they possibly, they can learn things to do something about.
Going back to your point, Rob, about it being very much a preventative intervention, and one of the things that we never did was call it a wellbeing project.
No, exactly.
Because we didn't, as you said, Anna, we're not clinicians. We're not trained to kind of work on a wellbeing project. Instead, we were taking that, learning the 5 steps to wellbeing. We got some great training from Jane Howard at Artswell about kind of good practice around that, and I think just not to stigmatise students. So we would say things that would hint at connect with others, de-stress, boost your confidence, but I think that was kind of key to the project as well, and recruiting the right students who would benefit from those particular interventions.
Absolutely.
Anything else in terms of the impact that you think it had on either students or staff?
Well, I know you presented at the CAT Days this year the model, and I think the staff that participated in the sessions that you ran were really interested in it, and also the staff that were involved in the delivery. So there's a long list of staff that were involved in the delivery, and the more they became involved, the more passionate they became about it. So actually what you did was to create sort of a broader bubble or broader pot of passionate people that understood what we were trying to do, really, and the potential benefits of it. And I think that was really good, because you cannot do these things in isolation. You have to get ownership and you have to get traction across an organisation, and that way you start to you get this dynamic, evolving kind of mindset, an organisational mindset. So you have to start somewhere, but I think that through the work that you did, Sasha, you really started to reach out. So you wrapped around you other academics in the university, and then you did CAT, and you showed people what it was that was so powerful about it.
With Pebbles from Porthtown Beach.
With Pebbles from Porthtown Beach.
What have each of you learnt about Springboard Studios, and what sort of impact do you think it's having on your role in the university? I know that you're in a new role now, Rob, as a kind of creative HE institution.
So I think there was a moment, I think probably academically I knew this, there was a moment of clarity and perhaps a change of behaviour in that fundamental link between resilience and career development, in terms of what the employability team, how we talked about that with students, how those principles got embedded in the other stuff that we were doing through the taught curriculum. Hopefully, I've left that team now. Hopefully that is an ongoing legacy with the work that happens in terms of making that actually a really important component of embedded work. And there's very kind of old models of employability that do talk about self-efficacy, etc., being really important components of employability. I think that took it perhaps from a kind of academic concept into something quite real and tangible for students. So I hope that is an ongoing legacy for students at Falmouth to have employability approached from a well-being and resilience angle.
How about you, Cam?
That's a difficult question considering my role, but building on top of the employability, I'm putting words in your mouth a little bit here, Rob, but I got the impression that previously the institution saw employability as the tail end of the student journey. And I think one thing we found was it has to be embedded right from the start, not label it as employability, but just build their resilience. It's the access into the university, and then that success. And that success all the way through to alumni in the future. We're building a relationship with these young people. So don't think of it as a third year only intervention, because it might be too late by then.
Exactly.
And actually, as a university, we get judged on our graduate outcomes anyway. So just build it in early. And that non-assessed bit, that was a pivotal point for me, that de-stressing it, doing it outside of curriculum was probably the biggest impact for me.
And what about thinking about some of the challenges we were talking about with that funding, bureaucracy? Might that change some of the questions you might ask of potential calls before they come out?
Well, certainly we've learnt what questions to ask before we go into another call. As I say, with each layer of contract management, you can't fight the bureaucracy. They're going to add some added value from their perspective. Ironically, every single European structural investment fund talks about simplification from the previous one. We just never learn. I say we as a nation or as a program, we just add layers of complexity. So I think we're wiser. We know what the pitfalls are before we get into a contract for delivery. We know what sort of words to build into our narrative to just give us that flexibility. I don't think we could ever steer away from complete lack of bureaucracy.
Yeah, and I think in many ways this call was quite, in a way we did write it in a way that was very, very flexible. And probably that in itself is probably a learning piece as well. And I know Cam and I, when we've been looking at stuff recently, it's been, okay, how do we make this stuff as open? How do we give ourselves enough space to be creative, to be innovative,
exactly,
within, whilst meeting the outputs of the call? And
also the partnership. I think Anna might agree with this. Healthworks for Cornwall was the overall brand, and it included 9 partners at the start, was it? We lost a couple along the way. But partnership, identifying who you're partnering up with will determine how much flexibility you might have. And I think across 9 partners from such a diverse range, you're not going to have one size fits all, which is probably one of the problems we had, was they were judging the managing authority, Cornwall Council in our case, were judging us through the same lens they were judging the other 8 partners with completely different offers.
They were. But what I would also say is it's absolutely fine to be different. And our difference has been celebrated. There's no doubt about that. But also one of the learning points for me is with the new funding mechanisms that are out there is to not be afraid as an organisation to actually go for them if we can respond to the need that our students are experiencing. And you can make it work. It's not easy and you have to be really committed to it, but you can make it work. And it's the benefit to the student that keeps you going. So those are the key learning things for me. And in terms of sort of personal learning, it's I'm learning so much about neurodiversity as I go along, in other projects as well, but how those come together so you get a better understanding of the impact of neurodiversity within an educational setting and on young people. This is for me, it's been such a learning journey, and it's absolutely crucial as we go forward. And I think the other thing that is really interesting for me, because I'm not creative particularly, is that every time I say that, Sasha will say anyone can be creative. Anyone could. All you need is a pen and a piece of paper. And actually I think that is very true. And the benefits to dawdling with a piece of paper and a pen, you can feel your mind stilling. You can feel, you can actually feel this happening to you. So I think learning from the creative programs, thinking about the creative programs, just kind of quietly doing it myself, you think, actually, this isn't just academic stuff, this is real, and that's really important.
Great. What does the future hold?
Where's everyone looking at me? So I've very recently changed roles, as we've said. So my focus is now on working on short courses, CPD, exec education, and leisure type courses. So I think there's a huge amount of learning through this project, which has kind of probably helped shape how we will approach some of these things. So initially we're very much looking at non-credit bearing, i.e. non-assessed CPD. I think there's some really interesting things about well-being and about health that can definitely be explored through this model, and looking at how we kind of build that into a life cycle. So yes, we are delivering these courses, but how does that feed back into the student experience? How do we make the benefits for either the local community or our student community in the stuff that we're doing? So it's quite exciting, and I suppose taking quite a lot of learning from this project into that role is really quite exciting.
That's great to hear, Rob. Anna, how about you?
So from my perspective, there's a couple of key things, and the first thing is that there are some things that are really easy and creative that you don't need any money for. I now always carry a box of STEM tools when I go and do anything with young people. It's amazing the impact they have. You don't even have to say anything about it. They just take it, they play it. It's amazing. So that's the first thing. But the second thing is how we need to start to really look at some longitudinal research about that. And I think that we are ideally placed as a creative university to do that. And what I would like to see, and Rob, you said right at the outset of this project, if we're implementing this with the third year, it's actually too late. So I would like to see this programme being lifted, and us to be doing some really sort of robust research around how a programme like this can support young people in their first year of university, so that we start to look to see if it can be valuable within a retention type mode. And then once we've got some data about that, actually then look at, can we get some research funding so that we're looking at supporting students who are that are more likely maybe to sort of not be retained, and actually work with them in this type of model all the way through into employment, so that we're with them or they're with us for 3 years. We do a load of longitudinal studies around their mental health and well-being, the impact of creative practice on that, the non-assessed, altruistic, the place-based, blue, because I think there's so much in there. So for me, it's about developing a legacy research profile that really starts to dig underneath this And I think Springboard has been a fantastic example because we've already done the co-design. We've spent 3 years doing co-design. We have 220 young people that were engaged in this. This is not insignificant in terms of data for further research bids. So that's my plan. I think it's all of our plan, actually, isn't it? But also working closely with you then about Rob. I'm pointing to Rob. Working closely with you about how this learning can be supportive of the work that you're now doing.
Great.
What can I add? So personally, I hope the future includes the learning from this project, this pilot, to embed it at Falmouth University. So work with our other professional services, work with our academics. Don't let that legacy just kind of filter away. And then alongside the research funding, and I know Anna's constantly looking at me when we're talking about funding, research, yes, but also, is it a model that's transferable to other universities? We're not alone here. Yes, geographically we've got our own challenges, etc. But surely there's some lessons there that can be the model for others who work in the higher education sector. So,
yeah.
And I think just kind of building on those points, I think the thing that you mentioned, Cam, about it being a 3-year programme, I think these longer programmes give you that flexibility.
Yeah.
Sometimes you get these kind of like, carrots of funding to do a year here and a year there, and it just doesn't give you the time, one, to develop those relationships with colleagues, with your students, but also gives you the kind of agility and flexibility, as you mentioned, 2 years of action learning before we actually got to that nugget. And I think as sort of kind of just finishing off, really building on your point about the learning, what we did wasn't that complex. If there's any academics that are kind of listening out there, hopefully one or two, is that what we did wasn't complex. We took existing research from Daisy Fancott. Anyone can read that. We took the 5 steps to well-being: noticing the world around you, connecting with others, being active. What are the others? Learning new things. Yeah, that's really easy to embed in a curriculum. Take your students on a walk. Teach them a different skill. If you're learning music, we're actually in the Academy for Music and Theatre Arts recording it. If you're learning music, bring in a creative writing practitioner, go for a walk to the beach. You're doing all of those things, place-based learning embedded with the 5 steps to wellbeing. It's not difficult, it's not complex, and it doesn't have to be expensive. So I think, for me, as a sort of takeaway, as a legacy, we talk about legacy and point and outcome. I think it's really easy to do, and it'd be great to see some colleagues in Falmouth and any other institutions taking some of that learning and embedding it into their curriculums.
And it's not just about the students either. The staff, we do an annual survey. We all suffer with wellbeing issues, so I think there's lessons there for us individually. Take some with our own teams. Why can't we take that model and just go out to the beach, etc.?
And it's really important because everybody has been impacted by COVID. We have lost connection, we have lost activity, we have lost all of those sorts of things. And for some people, it is taking a very long time to come out of that and to trust the world and everything. And we're asking the workforce a lot of the time, I'm not talking about Falmouth now, I'm talking about generally, we're asking people to just, get over it. It's done and dusted. Actually, psychologically and emotionally, it probably isn't done and dusted for an awful lot of us now. So, and we're not dealing with it. Young people say to me, they're so angry that, nationally and even globally, it's kind of, well, that happened then. Now you get on with your lives, They're so angry about it. And I think, so there's something very much about, this is a model that we could really be reaching out to the workforce. I think it's an excellent opportunity, again, for the non-acute, sort of emotional well-being side of everything. And again, you're right, Sasha, to a degree it's not difficult, it's not expensive, but it's an absolute commitment to the well-being of your staff, understanding that the pandemic has a massive impact. It's an impact that none of us have actually experienced before. There's no one alive now that experienced this with the Spanish flu, whenever that sort of, cropped up. And we need to be very thoughtful, I think, about a very long-term recovery programme for all of us, not just for young people.
Well, I think that brings us to the end of this final Springboard Studios podcast. I just want to say a massive thanks to Rob, Anna and Cam for being here on the last Wednesday before we break up for Christmas. It's appreciated, with a lot of staff have already gone on leave. So thanks very much for your time this afternoon and for being part of such a brilliant team working on such a brilliant project.
Yeah, and thank you, Sasha, for all
Thank you.
your effort. Yeah. It's been a pleasure.
It has.
This podcast has been part funded by the European Social Fund.